Hi, I'm Pamela K. Kinney, and I'm here to talk about plagues, pandemic, and the paranormal. Now, nowadays we have COVID-19. We're all at stay at home, on lockdown. Some of us are essential workers, forced to go, we're working, hospitals, grocery stores, utility places like wastewater, sewer, wastewater, and water and everything else. So we're all at home, sitting home bored mostly. But we are being constantly assaulted by reminders of all archaic pandemics. I'm thinking what's happening nowadays is actually affecting the spirits. Probably the old spirits, the ones that have been passed away due to regular things, maybe even past pandemics around here. Because there's more and more people dying. Right here in Virginia, at least the last count was 581 people that had passed away here due to COVID-19. Everywhere else, look at New York itself, not just New York City, but I heard the second biggest was up in Buffalo, so area, Erie County. So that shows you how many people are passing away from this all over the world. And I've had odd things happening here. We found on our ring a few weeks ago, odd things darting in and out on the porch one early morning, and one of them actually leaving from the house door to the middle of the porch and then dissipating just like a ghost would. So that's not a bug. The others you can say so, maybe, but that was pretty odd. Another thing is last week when I turned around, I heard some noise, and I saw a figure standing there in colorful, and then it just gone just like that. Another thing was a few nights ago, I was awake in my bed reading, as I always do at night, trying to help me sleep during the night. Reading does that, tones me down. When I heard a very loud crash, my husband was asleep, but I got up, walked out here. The cat hadn't done it. She was asleep on the couch still. And I looked all around thinking something had fell, but found nothing that was out of sorts. So is that the spirits all upset for what's going on? Is it other ones? Maybe someone trying to contact me, telling me the passing, want me to, with the being able to see and feel and hear ghosts, that maybe they wanted me to pass on them. I don't know. And so we're going to talk about the past ones. There have been other two big ones. One is the Bubonic Plague, the Black Death, in one term at one point it was called. And then, of course, there's the Spanish flu. Plus, we'll talk about a couple others, Yellow Fever and Tuberculosis, which hit here in the United States. Now, the Black Plague actually has been the scourge of mankind since its inception. It's been responsible for various apocalyptic events and mass extinction scenarios. One, of course, is the Black Death pandemic that hit Europe in the 14th century. And in fact, the word quarantine came from that, in that era, from actually an Italian word. It said that ships would dock and voluntarily shut down in bays outside of harbors for 40 days before they let anything out. Far more insidious version of it was the Neolithic decline from 6,000 years ago. And during that period, population just simply plummeted. One day there were people, next time there were mass graves. Now, a scientist, as of 2019, last year, actually thinks that the Black Plague, Black Death, was actually the culprit. The Black Plague still exists today. The Bubonic Plague, as we call it. A most recent one was back in 1994 in a remote region of Europe. And I'm sure lately, if I had really searched, it would have been just lately. Now, it was never used, the name Black Death was never used in its initial outbreak. Written by Simon D. Covinus, he named the disease, he called it Ultra Moris. And a piece of macabre history connected to that is that there were so many deaths in bodies during that time in Europe that many bleached bones were used to build homes and churches. One of these still stands today, actually, in Kutna Hora, if I'm pronouncing it, Czech Ossery, in the Czech Republic. And you can actually probably dig it up online, and you will get to see online pictures of all the skeletons and the skulls. There is something called a plague cross back then. It started appearing all over Europe on that time. They were using markers or structures to kind of pinpoint an infected house, or to even later use to commemorate the dead. Each time there was an outbreak of this kind, Even now, to the Spanish flu on, the Pope would actually pray under a plague cross. Now, there was one that was actually, by legend, reputed to vanquish the 1522 outbreak of the plague in Rome. For 16 days, monks would march with the cross through a non-stop procession and beat back the plague. It's a holy relic said to perform miracles. Did it cause and ended the plague then? Good question. Or it could be just, it was time for the plague to die. Now the treatments for that Black Plague would horrify you from what we have to go through today. If you think today wear a mask and all sorts of stuff are bad, well, they believe that God doesn't like us to be bathed. Okay, I'm Catholic. That's not what I ever heard. So they showered themselves with urine and dung. They slept with dead sheep, added aromatic herbs to beverages, avoided bad thought, stayed happy, and avoided lechery. Supposedly that would help them cure. Odd. Plague doctors became the norm at that point. They weren't really doctors as we know it. They were actually hired to do this, to don these outfits, to go out and I guess give them things, probably things that weren't very helpful, obviously. And an interesting comment with plague doctors, they've been around a lot longer than that. There was actually, I remember a couple of years ago, I saw a show on one of the Travel Channel, which actually happened here in Virginia, around I think Louisa County, where they had the earthquake. And after the earthquake, because of it, that's when they started seeing the son of the family living there kept saying he saw the Birdman. Well, he was getting very frightened of the Birdman. So when they finally saw something like that too, and they had investigators come there, they actually found out that somebody, when they got after the earthquake, found all these bones and stuff uprooted and rotting mask and that actually it looked like a plague doctor had died during, I guess, a plague there, and had been buried there. So he was actually haunting the place. And that's an interesting story connected to a plague. Now, ghost ships were somewhat common. They're not talking about, you hear about the Flying Dutchman, we know that story, but not ghosts moving the ship, but actually people emerging with someone to vessels adrift in the sea and find it that nobody was on it, they were all dead. So the ships actually would drift along because of this when people died. And that is where we probably got the whole legend of the Flying Dutchman from. Now there is a island in Italy, northern Italy, outside near Venice, that is an island called Poblagia Island. Now for the Black Plague, when it first, way before this, people were brought there to die when they were up different plagues. So when the Black Death hit Europe, and of course Italy is part of Europe, they would actually put the bodies in there until they amassed thousands of bodies there from this, thousands of graves. Even people that suspected anybody of having some kind of illness, it didn't have to be the Black Plague. Think about it. If you had a common cold or something else, they made that victim go over there and stay on that island to die. So a lot of people died from this, horribly. Some probably terribly weren't with the plague, and they probably realized after they were dead that it was not the plague, but who knows? They died and probably even got the plague at that point that caused them the death. So we have all those spirits that are still haunting that place. They actually would say that to this, the terrifying negative energy that was left because of all this, it still remains there. Even the island's very, very so. And there's, of course, ashes of all those that died in it. A lot of them burned in it. They were burned there, so there's ashes dug into the dirt. So you got bodies stuff in the earth. To this day, fishermen don't even like to fish around the area because they might come up with skulls and skeletons that are those that weren't burned that were still there. So in the waters from this. Now, it was in 1922 they opened up a mental hospital in the place. So now you got a mental hospital. Add that to all the horribly terrible plague victims. One legend is about it. Tells of one doctor who liked to do notorious experiments on his patients. He believed that lobotomies were a good way to treat and cure mental illness. He performed them on a lot of patients. He used hammers, chisels, and drills. No anesthesia, no sanitary, way of doing it. And he saved his darkest ones for his special patients. And who he took to the hospital's bell tower. It's said that he eventually lost his mind, and from his own torturous things he was doing, he ran up to the bell tower and threw himself from that to his death below. Now, the other stories connected with this, is that there's various accounts of it. Some say that he may have been pushed either by an angry island spirit, maybe one of the plague victims, or some of his living furious patients. There's a story that a nurse witnessed his fall, and she claims that he was still alive, that suddenly a mist covered him, and when it dissipated off of him, they found him choked to death. They say to this day they can still hear the screams of the tortured, which probably would be both the mentally ill, being hurt like that, and those dying from the plague. They claim that people that go on the island, sneak on the island, claim that they are being followed, watched. They see shadows along the wall. They are pushed by invisible forces against walls, and some actually chased down corridors. Some were actually even scratched. And psychics who are brought to the island claim that they feel a malignant energy, whether due to the hospital or the plague victims, or more likely from both. It's a very, very haunted spot. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, ahead of time, the Spanish one, before we go on to the top 7 plague pandemic hauntings in the U.S. We're going to talk about the Spanish one. And I have notes here, so I apologize, but it's a lot of stuff out there. Let me put this aside. Okay. Pandemic. Okay, that'll be on this one. Okay. This is the Spanish flu. Number one, it's not quite a flu as we think of the flu that we've been taking shots for. It actually is in the same coronavirus as COVID is. So it's a sort of a different type of flu. And actually, there is to this day, not a few years ago, in 2009 was it? The swine flu. That actually is a version of it that came back. So, like I said, it's called the H1N1 virus, but they call it the Spanish flu. Number one, it was originally called the French flu, started in France. But at some point, I guess Spanish reporters, maybe someone from, I think, a nobility of Spain died. It got tacked on with the Spanish flu. Now, it said more U.S. soldiers died from the 1918 flu than during the battle in World War I. 36% of the army became ill. There were no effective vaccines or antivirals back then. Nobody developed it. And it made worse as there was a shortage of physicians and other health workers all over the world. So that last fact alone was probably more instrumental to the flu's fatalities than anything else. Mass graves were dug by steam shovels, and some of these places, now that littering large swaths of Europe and the U.S., are said to be haunted by ghosts of those buried in the soil. Several Pacific islands, too, also despite their isolation and not being way up, it's the opposite, were particularly hit hard, like Nauru, Fiji, Tonga, and Western Samoa, because ships that came there were carrying the flu. Doctors actually, and not everybody died directly because of the flu. Let's go on to that. At this point, it was back in the 19th century, Bayer Aspirin invented aspirin, okay? Well, doctors back then recommended it. In fact, they recommended 30 grams a day. And that's a dose that nowadays is considered toxic. In fact, anything over 4 grams is now considered unsafe. But back then, obviously, they didn't think. Um, Over 33% of the people suffer from hyperventilation, pulmonary edema, and buildup of fluids in lungs due to this medical screw-up. Though the Black Death was more pernicious and horrible, there are more deaths considered to the Spanish due to this and the flu itself. It killed over 100 million people. And now we'll go on to the top haunted places in the U.S. to do close to or connected to the pandemic. We'll start with the Spanish Military Hospital in St. Augustine, Florida. It has all manners of supernatural activity, doors slamming, unearthly wails, cold spots, and bloody puddles on the floorboards. People have mattered all sorts of stuff, even feeling describing all-consuming force that seems to shroud the historical building in a funeral veil. The next one is the Dry Tortugas National Park. It's a series of Caribbean Keys, part of it, and it is one of the most visited spots in Florida. It's heavenly, it's idyllic, but it also houses one of the nation's oldest and bloodiest prisons. And as we know today, with going out with COVID, prisons are a pretty good petri dish for any type of virus spreading really easy, because there is no way of self-keeping apart. And back then they didn't even think of that. Fort Jefferson, located on Garden Key, is where Dr. Samuel Mudd was imprisoned until he was granted a presidential pardon. Now, he was part of the collaborators of Booth in the assassination of President Lincoln. But because they gave him the pardon, they wanted him to help. He was instrumental in saving dozens upon dozens of lives during a rather severe yellow fever outbreak in the fort. So some maybe died, but a lot of them did not because of him. Probably a really good doctor at this point. The next one is the Rolling Hills Asylum in New York. It was a reconverted farmhouse filled to the rafter with, of course, paranormal stuff. At that point, New York at one point suffered a tuberculosis outbreak. So countless patients were shipped in there, and most of them died buried in unmarked graves just outside its doors. Now, how many died? There aren't any actual figures, but it's theorized over 17K. Of course, it came to Asylum for the Criminally Insane afterwards. So you add spirits from those dying from the outbreak, and then you got those that died because they were criminally disturbed at the point, and you got a really haunted spot. The next one is the Biltmore Hotel in Miami, Florida. Florida seems to have a lot. It's known in the supernatural community as a place where the ghost of the gangster Thomas Fatty Walsh has been seen. Well, after he was gunned down and his family started haunting the 13th floor, and by the way, most hotels do not have a 13th floor. If next time we get back to normal and you check out a hotel, I want you to check out your hotels, because they seem to go from 12 to 14. Very rarely is there a 13. There is, but they make it a 14 or a 12. But anyway, the U.S. entered World War II. During that time, war effort converted a lot of hotels in Miami, including the Biltmore because of its big size, as military hospitals. Well, after the war, each time an outbreak hit Miami, the city council grabbed it and stacked it to the ceiling with dying patients. So it had a lot of outbreaks there, and a lot of them that maybe died there due to that. Another possible haunting would be the Alcatraz Island. Now, as like I mentioned earlier, because of COVID-19, we know now how many prisons can be affected when an outbreak happens, even outside of it. And as San Francisco is across the water, it would be no different. So if yellow fever tuberculosis hit the mainland, it hit there too. Well, it's an interesting thing to know about all this, that there is so much of this going on in the world, that we have so much of this going on in the world. And I wanted to know that if anybody here has had any experiences lately, if they had a loved one that died in one of these hospitals during COVID, with COVID, and they've had experiences in their home. They maybe woke up and thought they saw a shadowy figure at the foot of the bed that reminded them it was their mother, father, or sister, or brother, or son, or whatever, a friend. Or if you had things disappearing mysteriously, that you know that you put somewhere and it wasn't there, only come back and it was probably there again or something, or somewhere else. Or if you had anything else off the normal happening on your Ring doorbell videos or anything like that. If you could leave a comment at the Facebook event page for this Paranormal Quarantine Con, leave a comment, tell them about it. Or I'm hoping that Haunt John's will add up a poll for that, like she was thinking about, and you can even put it to that. Or on my page, my author page for Facebook, not my regular, but my author page. If you go to it, you can leave. I'll have a post there about saying leave it, any stories there, and you can leave your stories there about that. It'd be interesting to see if we can tally that this one too is having some effects from all of this, because after all, you have pandemics, you're going to have the paranormal. Stay spooky and stay safe, and enjoy the rest of the Paranormal Con. And good night.